me. The way I introduce myself before this talk usually is by saying, hi, I'm Rabbi Eliana Jacobowitz. I'm the Rabbi Temple Bnei Brit in Somerville. I'm an Israeli by birth, and I'm a third-generation Holocaust survivor. It's one of the first things about my identity that come up when I talk about things. And so today I'm just sharing with you really just one tiny story, the story of the family of my father. And it is just really a drop in the ocean of stories, many of which don't get to be told. Many of which don't get to be told because nobody survived to tell those stories. Many of those don't get to be told because the people who lived through these stories were unable to bring themselves to talk about what happened to them. So I share this story because I can, because I'm alive today and I'm able to share this story. And that reason that I'm alive, I feel like it compels me to share this story. But it is not the most beautifully rounded story because it's not a Hollywood production, it's an actual story. So there are gaps in the story. There are gaps in what we know about what happened with my family. And some of those I might just forget. So if you ask me later, I will fill in those gaps. But some of those I will just have to say, we have no idea what happened with that person. So that's just, I guess, the reality of this story. The other thing I wanted to say before I begin is that one of the things that bother me about the way the Holocaust is being talked about in this country is that often we see those pictures of people in the camps. And what happens is that we see people when they are already dehumanized. We see them after their hair has been shaved, their clothes, every sign of their individuality has been taken away from them. And even though we're not looking at them with eyes that have any bad intention, we're not really seeing an entire person with an entire life from before this thing happened. And we're not really seeing what is happening to them in the context of an entire full life. Which is why I'm going to start this story a little bit before, and I'm going to end it a little bit after, rather than just tell you what happened exactly during the Holocaust with my family. So here we go. I'm going to make myself smaller. You will see why in a second. Grandparents. These are my grandparents. My grandmother, Marisha, and my grandfather, Tuvia. I know in this country, we usually say Tavie, but it was kind of pronounced Tuvia for his life. And as you see, they were just like normal young people. They were high school sweethearts, went to the same school, and grew up in Lodz, which was the second largest city in Poland. About 1/3 of the residents of Lodz were Jewish. There was a huge Jewish population, 233,000 Jews in Lodz before the war. And so they were kind of like urban kids. And as was customary in the middle class back then, it was common that the people in Lodz would go to summer in the mountains where the weather was better. So they would all go to this place called Zakopane. I guess it was kind of like the Catskills of Poland, but I like to think about it more like the Cape or Maine. They will just go for rent a house, go for a few weeks, and bring their own bicycles and do all of their normal stuff. So here you see my grandparents in Zakopane one summer, like having fun, summer fun. And here's another one the following summer, still pretty much in love, happy in nature. And of course, you can't have a good vacation without swimming. So they also got to do some swimming. And this is kind of like their life. They thought they had it all figured out. They finished high school. They were planning to go on to college. They went to college. My grandmother wanted to be a history teacher, so she studied history in university. My grandfather wanted to be an engineer, so he went to law school. Which is to say, even though life for Jewish people in Poland, in a city where they were 1/3 of the population, was pretty good, it was not the same as the life of being not Jewish in Poland at that time. So my grandfather wanted to be an engineer, but the Polish government had numerous clauses, like a number of Jews, a quota for Jews in tech professions. They wouldn't let more than a certain number of Jewish people study technical professions, which were desirable professions. So he wanted to be an engineer, but he had to settle for going to law school, which, by the way, he continued to hate for the entirety of his life. It was his profession for his entire life. He never liked it. He always wanted to be an engineer. But this is kind of how it was in that time. So they both went to college. They were happy. I'm going to leave them here happy with nature and introduce you to the rest of the family for a second. Meet the parents. Okay, so this is my grandmother's family. She had an older sister, which you see all the way there. And the picture in the middle is her mother. By the way, her sister is also in this vacation area, as you can see from that pile of witty stuff. The house where they lived in is right above my head. And that little very blurry picture that's on my side is the picture of my grandmother's father. We do not actually have the actual picture. So it's a picture of a picture in another one that is what we have. My grandfather's family, again, also on their vacation in the same area. They were very much into riding bicycles. So his father and mother in the center. My grandfather is the one all the way closest to me. Next to him is his brother Shlomo, his youngest brother, and all the way on the other end is David. There are 3 boys. That's the family. So I'm going back to my grandparents. They finished college. Look how good they look. They're very fashionable. They're very happy. They were ready to take on the world. They had like this amazing plan. Their plan was finish college, probably around June. They will get married in July, go on honeymoon in August, and come back in time for the beginning of the school year in September so my grandmother can start her teaching job. And the plan worked pretty well to start with. They did get married in July. They did go on local honeymoon somewhere in Poland. They had their apartment that they were looking to move into when they got back from their honeymoon. There it went a little bit bad because on September 1st, 1939, World War II started. Hitler, who already annexed Austria and some other regions, marched onto Poland, and Poland was taken very quickly without much resistance. So some geography for your benefit. What you see in this picture, all the brown areas that you see there, all of that is Poland. The darkest part, the part that is closest to Germany, was the part that Germany took first. You can see that Lodz is right there in that part that fell to the Germans first. What the Germans have done is on August 23rd, like a week before the Germans marched into Poland, the Germans and the Russians have made an agreement, a treaty, the Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement, that basically said Poland doesn't really need to be a country. Half of the places in Poland, people speak Russian, half of it, people speak German. So why don't you Russians take the part where people speak Russian? We'll take the part where people speak German, and in return, we will all be happy and prosper financially. Nobody asked the Polish people what they want. The world at this point was not really very interested. And so the Germans took half of Polish out of Poland at that point, including Lodz. And that's when the story of my family during the Holocaust begins. My grandmother's sister was the first one to die. She came to the wedding. She was a college student in Warsaw, which is not very far. You can see here on the map, Lodz and Warsaw are not that very far. They're about an hour and a half in today's traffic, in modern traffic. So she was on her way back to college in Warsaw from being at the wedding. And on the way, we believe that she was raped and killed. We do not know where she's buried. We do not know, other than the fact that my grandmother knew that she was raped and killed. We don't know anymore about what happened at that time. We also don't know for sure whether it was because she was Jewish or just because she was unfortunate. She was the first one to die. My sister is named after her. After she died, after my grandmother's sister died, the family decided to have a family meeting. By the family, I mean my Marisha's parents and Tuvia's parents, my grandparents' parents, all of them got together and they decided that they need to figure out how to make sure that they're safe. They figured that they themselves, the parents, cannot just up and leave because they had their jobs. Things couldn't possibly get any worse than they already are, and they needed to stay. Tuvia and Marisha, because they were newlyweds, the decision was that they will stay with their parents. They also had jobs. They will stay. And therefore, they decided to send the two other brothers, David and Shlomo, to send them east, to send them away to the east. And what they told them is just keep walking east until you hear Russian, but no longer hear Polish. This is how you will know pretty much that you arrived to where you want to be. And find yourself a job, stay on the down low. And that's what they've done. They went east, they found a job in the coal mines in a small city, small town where is modern day Ukraine. And what I can say about what happened after is that pretty soon after the war started, ironically, the Russians needed engineers. They needed mine engineers to work in the coal mines. And so they decided to send David to study engineering. And he became a mine engineer, but he had to go to Gorky to go to school. And so he had to leave Shlomo, who was very young at this point, alone where he was. And he was recruited by the Russians to continue to work in the coal mines, which is where he was for the next couple of months. And then he was drafted into the Red Army, and was fighting in the war in the Red Army. So Germans didn't wait a long time before they constructed the Lodz ghetto. First of all, we call it the Lodz ghetto, but the Germans changed the names of all the cities in Poland to German names. So when you will see letters and stuff from the ghetto, it is referred to as the Litzmannstadt ghetto, which was the German name that the Nazis gave to Lodz, during the war. They constructed the ghetto on December 10th, 1939. So as you can see, it's just a few months after the war starts. And the ghetto was a really not ideal place for people to live in. It was 4 square kilometers, but as you will see in a second, only 2.5 of those, a kilometer is less than a mile. So 2.5 of those kilometers, which is about 2 miles, 2 square miles, were houses. All the rest was space where people didn't live. And into that tiny space, they crammed about 165,000 of the Jews of Lodz. 1/4 of the Jews of Lodz have ran or moved at that point out of the city. So that was all the Jews that were remaining in the city from the 233,000 I told you about before. And 40,000 Jews from Austria and Germany and 7,000 Roma were also put in that ghetto. So it was tremendously, how to say, squishy. They had to be living in conditions where many, many people were living in a small space. The numbers you see on the right over my head, 877 were the number of people who were found alive in the Lodz ghetto when the Red Army arrived there at the end of the war. That's the people who survived, who stayed in the ghetto by the end of the war. And there's a thought that 10,000 Jews from Lodz eventually survived the war elsewhere. I guess you can say that my family is part of that 10,000 number. Show you the pictures of the ghetto here. So underneath you see a little map of the ghetto, and as you can see, that green area and there's some other areas. They're all areas where there aren't actually any houses. These pictures are not that great, one on top of the other. In my original PowerPoint, they're separate, like I add them one at a time, but in this, when I share screen, it just puts everything in one slide. So I'm sorry that it's a bit confusing. What you see in the picture are just 2 pictures from the Lodz ghetto. They built the ghetto in the poorest part, in the north part of Lodz. They just kind of like took over that poor part and moved the Polish people who lived there to the houses, to the better houses of the Jews that they moved into the ghetto. Because it was a part of Lodz that already was in existence, it crossed over 2 main roads. And so what you see at the top picture is one of the bridges that connect over the road that went past it. So there are fences on both sides, and regular life continues underneath that bridge. But the Jews, they're locked, they're completely separate in the ghetto, and they can only pass over at this, through this bridge at certain hours of the day, and they need special permits to be allowed from one part of the ghetto to the other. So even within the ghetto, you weren't able to move freely to all parts of the ghetto. And what you see in the picture below is just a picture of the head of the Judenrat, the head of the local Jewish government in the ghetto, talking to people. And I mostly just put this picture there so you can see how close together people were all the time, how there wasn't a lot of personal space anywhere in the ghetto. And this is important to me because, again, we often show pictures of the camps, of the concentration camps, but most Jewish people lived for a really long time in the ghettos, and life in the ghetto was a very fundamental part of the experience of the Holocaust for many Jewish people. This is a picture of my grandparents in the ghetto. I like this picture because it looks like they really are trying to smile, but they're not really having much success with looking smiling in this picture. So when they were moved to the ghetto, the two sets of parents were put in the same house, in the same apartment. But my grandmother and my grandfather were given their own little room because they were newlyweds. And the room that they received was very close to the wall of the ghetto. The Germans, basically the government in the ghetto, meant that there was an internal government for the Jews. Like the Jews were supposed to self-govern themselves inside the ghetto. And there was also German patrols around the ghetto. And the German patrols were allowed to execute on the spot any Jewish person who tried to leave the ghetto. And so the apartment that they received was really close to the wall of the ghetto, and those German patrols really enjoyed getting drunk at night and just doing shooting practice into the apartments in the ghetto by the wall. And so those apartments were really unsafe. Like you couldn't be at home without risking someone shooting at you while you're in your home. In addition, my grandfather, one day he left the house and he was very severely attacked and abused by German soldiers. So much so that he told my father that he was sure that he wasn't going to live through, that he really believed they will end their fun and games with him by just putting a bullet through his head. And when he got home that night, he just wasn't able to be there anymore. So my grandparents ended up moving in with their parents, despite how cramped the space was, because they just couldn't stay in the location that they were assigned. And so they are living at this point, the whole family together in one room, pretty much. And when I teach to high school students, I need to teach quite a lot about what life in the ghetto was like. But I imagine that some of you know and understand the implication of life in the ghetto. The Judenreich, the Jewish government, was trying to preserve a sense of normal life. They had their own theater. They tried to have some theaters. They had an education system. They have the school. The kids continue to go to school in the ghetto. So my grandmother worked as a teacher in the ghetto, which wasn't what she envisioned for her career, but she was able to work as a teacher in the ghetto. My grandfather worked for the sanitation department of the ghetto, which is not as cool as it sounds. I'm kidding, I don't think sanitation sounds so cool anywhere, but sanitation in ghetto conditions is extra not fun. And he also was working as a car mechanic part of the time, and it seems like he also was put to work in a one of the metal factories. What basically the Germans did is they used the Jews as a cheap, as free workforce for the war effort. And so they had them producing a bunch of the stuff that they needed for elsewhere. So yeah, so they have made all of those things that were actually not for use in the ghetto. The ghetto at this point has its own currency, the Jewish mark, which is not good for use anywhere else. It was one of the ways that they prevented Jews from escaping the ghetto. Their money wasn't good anywhere. And also, they had to sell almost anything they had to pay for black market for food. They say that people in the ghetto consisted on about 700 calories a day, which is not enough for people, and is not enough for people who are worked very hard. And so this is the period in the history of the Holocaust before the final solutions, where the German were planning for the Jews to die of natural causes. I don't know this from my grandparents. I know this from when I learned in university about the Holocaust. There was a plan that people would just die of natural causes, which is a nice way of saying if you starve people for long enough, you work them for long enough, they will just drop dead on their own. And so, show another picture. This is another picture of my grandparents in the ghetto. This is in one of the workspaces where my grandfather worked. And I have a picture here of, yeah, not this one. This one is a picture of him working in one of the jobs that he had in the ghetto. As you see, it's kind of like physical work that they had to do. So the first person to die in the ghetto was my grandfather's father. Because he died early on, he died of natural causes. Starvation that led to consumption, that led to death. And that was considered a very natural way to die. Because he died relatively early on, he was buried. Because in the beginning, the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in the ghetto was still handling burials, and there were still markers on the grave. People who died in the ghetto later were buried, but without markers. There were too many people who died every day, so they just buried them together without having markers. But we do know where those graves are, and they exist. And so this is the grave of my great-grandfather in Lodz, in the place that was the Lodz ghetto. The mark on this stone was put together by someone else after the war. It is not the grave marker that was there when he died. We know that because what it says on this marker is, aside for "Here lies Avigdor Jacobowitz," who died in the Valley of Despair in the ghetto of Lodz on this date, and in memory of his wife, Fege Kaufmann, who was killed by the evil Hitler in the concentration camp in Ravensbrück. And so we know that someone put this there later after the war. And I'm also kind of like giving you the scoop that his wife didn't survive either. I don't think it's a big surprise. This is a picture from the metalworking facility. So one of the things that were really nice, quote unquote, about life in the ghetto is that the Germans were pretty happy with how they managed stuff with the Jews. So they will have those occasions where they will bring German dignitaries to see how well the Jews are working for the Germans and producing stuff. And it is very likely that this picture is one of those photo shoots that the Germans have done to have kind of like to show off how well they're doing. These are just documents, work documents from the ghetto that I thought might be of interest to see. You can see at the bottom one, the one that's right next to me, it says at the top, Arbeits resort, which is basically work permit, and it is signed. And you can see at the bottom of that stamp, it says Lichmannstadt Ghetto. They didn't use the name Lodz Ghetto. These documents are the work documents of my mother's mother, my grandmother's mother. And they had specifications about what hours they're allowed to be out of their house, whether they're allowed to be out after curfew if they were working in some factories that were working around the clock, and stuff like that. It was very well organized. This is the full picture of the picture I showed you before. It's my grandmother looking at the picture of her father. He was the next one to die. He died supposedly of a heart attack that was likely caused, again, by starvation and the fact that his health really deteriorated in the absence of medication and food and stuff. We do not know where he is buried. They already did not have probably markers on the grave sites at that point. So at this point, it is my grandparents and the two mothers that are surviving. If you look at this map, I'm giving you a second to orient yourself. My direction is difficult here, but here, Lodz is above my finger right now. And if you find Lodz, you will see that the concentration camps that are close to it are Chelmno, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz. And so a lot of the people in the Lodz ghetto were sent regularly to Auschwitz and Treblinka, Chelmno, Majdanek. Those were the concentration camps. It was well located for those concentration camps, and there were trains that were leaving with people to the concentration camps every day. This is the part of the story where things break down a little bit as far as my ability to tell you what happened. At some point, my grandfather was taken from the ghetto. There was what they called an aktia, where they would just call all the men, the children, depending who they wanted of a certain age. They told them all to appear. They got them out of their houses. They got them into a designated place. They put them on cars, on trains, and they just send them somewhere. And people knew that if you were sent somewhere, you were likely not coming back. And so my grandfather did not come back one day, and he was put on a train and was taken to a work camp on the Baltic Sea, which you can see is all the way up north there, in somewhere on the Baltic Sea, and he worked in something that had to do with coal, offloading coal off ships. But that's all we know. I don't know which camp. I don't know what town he was in. And I really don't know what happened with him during the entire time that he was in this work camp there. My grandmother, along with her mother-in-law, were sent to what they call a transition camp. Transition camps was what you got when there was a work camp and a concentration camp together, like Auschwitz-Birkenau. And so they would bring people into this transition camp, and there they will decide who is healthy enough that they want to send them into a work camp, concentration camp, and who is going to be sent directly to death camps. We tend to call them all concentration camps in English, but there were some places where there were just crematoriums and gas chambers. People didn't stay there hardly at all. And then there were the concentration camps where people still got sent to the gas chambers, but they were also worked first until they were no longer able to work. And so my grandmother knew, like my grandmother saw her mother-in-law there. And so we know for a fact that her mother-in-law was killed there in that camp that they were in at first. And trying to see if I can remember. Yeah, don't remember the name of that particular camp they were in at that point. But my grandmother was sent to a work camp. She was sent to a work camp. At that point, the Germans are kind of like starting to be defeated, and they need a lot of work power to support munition factories and other stuff. And so my grandmother is sent to a work camp where they're creating parts for airplanes for the Nazi Air Force. And what they've done to prevent the Allied forces from finding those war camps and bombarding them, because they were creating weapons in those camps. They put those entire camps underground in mines. And so she spent like months underground working. And she said that it was only because she says she was fortunate that the job she had in that factory was to drill holes in those aluminum things, and that the drill would produce heat, and that the heat from the drill was the only thing keeping her from pretty much freezing to death. But she wasn't doing very well. At some point, she got very sick. She developed an infection. She had really high fever. She was very concerned that when they make their next selection, that she will not be considered as someone who can continue to work. And so one of her friends, one of the people who were in the work camp with her, whom she knew from before, from Lodz, and was a midwife, just pretty much performed kind of like field surgery on her and tried to drain her infection, which saved my grandmother's life. But it's also to say that my grandmother, for the rest of her life, had the most ugly scar that goes all the way in the back of one of her legs. And she was also having really hard problem with her blood circulation in her leg. So she was disabled for the rest of her life as in some way as a result of this field surgery, but it did save her life. And she stayed in those work camps until the end of the war, until those work camps were, where they were released when the war was over. We do not know exactly how, exactly when my grandmother's mother died in the gas chambers, but she did die in the gas chambers in Majdanek. She was on one of those transports. And we found that out, the way people found that out after the war is that if you found someone that you knew, if you saw anyone, you would share that information. So when the war is over, people are just starting to collect information, and they find whatever they can, and they can't find everything. I want to transition a little bit and tell you a little bit about what happened. Yeah, let's see if I can see. Yeah, okay, I'll go here. Let's say the war is over. When the war is over, one of the things people don't talk about so much is that as part of this war in Europe, people removed all of the road signs. That too I learned in history, not from my grandparents necessarily, but there were no road signs to be found hardly anywhere in Europe. It was a way of not making it easy for the invading armies to find their ways. But it also meant that there were millions of displaced people at the end of the war who were making their way on those roads to try to get back to where they were originally from, and it wasn't that easy to navigate. But everyone is trying to get back to where they're from. So I will take a detour and tell you a little bit what happened with the youngest brother, with Shlomo. When we left him last, he was recruited into the Red Army at the young age of 17, I think. And he is with the Red Army, and he's part of those caravans that carry supplies through Russia, through the area where today is Iran and Iraq, all the way to Egypt. That was like the route that they take, bringing supplies for the Red Army. And at some point, they take for a break, they stop in an area where modern day Israel is. And he defects when they're there. He just, he tells his commander while his commander is drunk that he's really sorry. And then he runs off and he hides in some orange orchards, and he finds his way to the nearest kibbutz, and he stays there. And he changes his last name to Jacobi from Jacobowitz, so he can't be found on the records, because theoretically until the end of his life he remained there, hiding from the law, I guess. But after he's in the kibbutz for a few months, he can't handle it anymore because there's a war in Europe. His whole family is there. He can't just sit and work in an orchard. And so he joins Anders' army, which was a unit of the British Army for Polish soldiers. And he returns to Europe with Anders' army and fights in Italy for the Allied forces with the British Army. And this is where he is at the end of the war. At the end of the war, he's somewhere in Europe. And he decides that he's going to go look for his family to see if he can find any of the family that are still alive. So he makes his way to Lodz, and in Lodz he's just starting to knock on doors. You know, that's what he used to do. People will get back to where they are from. They will just basically sleep outside in the streets. There will be like communal boards with notes that people will write. I saw this and this person on this and this date in this and this location, and there'll be tons of notes like that, and people will just read through and try to find relatives. And so he's doing this for a while, and he learns that the parents are dead, that all the parents are dead, and he's told that that Tuvia died, or they think that Tuvia may have died, and he's like looking for a while. He's doing this search for a while in the ghetto. What I have here is just to show you, this is a certificate where a Jewish person found their way back to where they were from. The first thing they did is they signed up with the temporary Jewish committee. The temporary Jewish committee recorded all the Jews who came back so they can try to help people find their family. So this is a record that says that he arrived in Lodz after the war. And you can see the date at the top, May 18th, 1945. This is what Shlomo looks like at the end of the war. Remember when he was this really young, smiling little kid on his bicycle? This is what he looks like at the end of the war. He's a British soldier. And he's looking for his family pretty unsuccessfully. His plan is to try to see who's there, find who he can find, and if there's nobody alive, to just go back to what is then Palestine and kind of like figure it out from there. The first person he finds is my grandmother. When the war ends, let's do the black thing. Looks nice. When the war ends, my grandmother finds herself in some place in Germany, and she walks from that place back to Lodz. She has her own horror stories about that trip back. People were so starved and hungry. And she told me this story about how they would go, when they left like the camps, the people who resided in the towns that were near every one of those camps, they were like deserted, because the local population, as soon as the Red Army or the Allied forces released any of those camps, the local population felt like people will come for them, that they will come to take revenge over what they've done, because the local population is who worked in those camps. And so when my grandmother said that when they left, they were really hungry, and they found that there's nobody, everything was deserted. All of those towns that they were walking through were deserted. So they walked into the houses to look for food. And she said that there were places where it looked like everyone left, like there will be like a meal set on the table. They were in this house, there was a meal set on the table, and there were no people around, like, but the food was there. And some of the people who were with her just were so starved that they wanted to start eating right away. And there was this food, it's kind of like Polish German kind of like soup that they used to have, which is a cold soup, like a yogurt based yogurt and cucumber soup. And so there was like this soup in a big bowl, and people were really hungry. And then one of the women who was with them, like she took that forget the name of this, she took the big serving spoon and she put it into the soup and brought it out, and to show them that the people who lived in the house before they left, they broke all of their glass into the soup, and there were like glass shards inside of it that were meant to kill the people who ate from it. My grandmother said that some of the people were so hungry that they still tried to eat it regardless. But those were the kind of things that happened for them. They walked the roads, they were starved, they walked into the houses trying to find warmer clothes, trying to find food, but there was no food to find because most of the local population was also pretty starved. I mean, this war wasn't enjoyable for anyone. And they just walked and slept outside and tried to reach the place that they were coming from. So eventually she makes it to Lodz, and she finds Shlomo. And so she finds her brother-in-law, he finds his sister-in-law, and at that point they're the only ones who survive. And they're trying to find more information about whether my grandfather survived or not, because they already know that everyone else is dead. The only person they have no information about is my grandfather. This is a letter that Shlomo writes to my grandmother. Miriam Ayekara, dear Miriam, I am writing to you right now from Munich. I have passed through Frankfurt, and at the moment, I haven't found any news or any sign of Tuvia. I'm going to continue on my way to Berlin. I met the Cantors, but they know nothing about him. I'm writing really quickly so I can mail this to you. Please be well and do not despair, Shlomo. They were looking for my grandfather for some months, and all the news that they got is that he did not make it. They were almost ready to give up. They were thinking that they will just leave, try to get out of Europe together as the only surviving members of their family. When one day, Shlomo runs into someone in the street in Lodz, and that person says to him, look, I don't know who you are and whether you're looking for someone, but I just saw someone who looks just like you at this and that address. So Shlomo went to that address and they found my grandfather, who arrived back to Lodz and was also trying to find them. At this point, my grandparents reunite, which is why when I told this story to these elementary school kids in the Winter Hill elementary school, they told me that I should build this as a love story, because it's a love story about how my grandparents found each other back after the war. And I thought it was the sweetest thing, because when I think about this story, love is not the first thing that comes to mind, but maybe it is a love story, because they found each other and now they're trying to get out of Europe. They cannot go to the United States because the United States is not letting Jews in unless there is someone to sponsor them. And it is not that easy for Jews to move around at all in Europe. For any person to move in Europe, you couldn't move from one country in Europe to the other without having a special permit. So they needed to smuggle their way to move through Europe. And they were trying to get from Poland all the way to Belgium, to Antwerp. They're trying to get. And so what they're doing is, Shlomo is the only one of them who has real good reason to be where he is. He's still a British soldier and he has the uniforms and everything. So he is, I'll find this picture. He's basically dressing my grandparents in British soldier uniforms, because being in the Allied forces was the only way you could move around Europe without having special permits. And they're faking it as if they're British soldiers. Mind you, my grandmother couldn't speak one word of English. My grandfather, not so much better, but they were fake British soldiers for the purpose of getting out of Poland and trying to get to Antwerp. This is a picture of them when they actually arrived there. You see my grandfather is in the middle. Yeah. The picture I showed you before, I just like because it's a picture of my grandparents standing in front of one of the buildings in Antwerp. But you can see on top of it those big signs that they put all around the streets in Europe of kind of like bringing down the swastika, bringing down the Nazi regime. That was one of the marks of Europe after the war. Yeah, so they're kind of like wandering around Europe, trying to make it all the way to Antwerp because they're trying to get on a boat from there that might take them back to a place in Italy where they could get on a boat that they're hoping will take them to Israel, to Palestine. It is still under British mandate. Jews still cannot, there is no legal immigration for Jews to Palestine at that point. Jews, in case it's news for you, I think it's not, Jews had nowhere to go after the war. The war is over, but nobody wanted them. And so their choice was, America wasn't an option. The only option was to try to get illegally into the state of Israel. And that you needed to do by finding a boat that will be traveling to that region under whatever pretense they did. So they make their way back to Italy. On Italy, they make it onto this Turkish ship that is called Akbel. Really, what is kind of happening is that there were several boats. This is a long story that I'm not going to share with you today, but maybe another day. Maybe I will do a joint presentation with some of our relatives who are, some of our members who are relatives of Isidore Stone. But they were on the Exodus at some point. The boat that they were in was having difficulty in the middle of the Mediterranean. And so what happened is that they moved some of the people to different boats because the big boat was sinking and they were trying to move people to other boats. So my grandparents find themselves on the Akbel. I don't know whether it looks to you like a good ship when you look at it right from here. I understand that it was really old, really run down, barely floating piece of, garbage. And they put like tons of people on top of it. And they were all trying to pretend like they weren't there because the British Army was patrolling the waters. And if they found refugees, they would send them back. That's the good case. So here's a picture of my grandparents on this boat. If the boat looked good to you before, now you can see that it didn't look so good in person. There's an interesting story to this that my grandmother likes to tell, is that part of the ways that they were trying to get the British to not suspect the boats is that they will cover them in tar, like in black tar, which made the boats look somehow, I don't know, whatever. But it will get really warm and the tar will get soft. And my grandmother accidentally touched part of it and her clothes got stuck to the tar. And since she only had one piece of garments, which is what she was wearing on her body, she had nothing to wear. And so what you see her wearing here is a men's shirt, probably my grandfather, because he's only wearing a, what you call a wife beater in this country, though I hate that word. As you see from the other people, this is not what a person would normally wear outdoors, but he's only wearing that. So she's probably wearing his shirt. And the pants that she's wearing are they're men's pants that someone gave her, these shorts. And this is how she arrived. Like, this is how she made her way out of Europe, wearing these pieces of borrowed clothes. The British did not catch them when they were in the middle of the sea, but they did catch up with them when they were getting close to the shores of Israel. And as you know, the boats that the British caught were people were either sent to camps in Cyprus, or they would put in camps in a place called Atlit, which is in the north of Israel. So this is where my grandparents end up. They're in this camp, again, in a camp with fences. Again, they're not free to go into Israel, and they're there for a while. They make a connection with relatives, trying to get those relatives to appeal to the authority to find a way to release them from this camp and to let them go into Palestine, will be Israel. And what is above my head is a letter that a relative wrote to some connection that he has. It basically says, I am begging you to help release my niece and her husband, my cousin and her husband, who have lived through 7 rungs of hell in Europe, and they are the sole survivors of our entire family. Please have mercy and release them from the camp. That is basically what it says. And what you see on the bottom to my side is this is already in English now, so you can read yourself, but you can see this is the release paper of my grandfather that says that he's released from the clearance camp Atlit on this date. This is when they get out of the camp. And on top of that is his first ID card, which is for British Mandate Palestine card. So they're finally free people. Of course, the next thing that happens is that he joined the IDF, because Israel announces its independence and the War of Independence begins right away. So he's again fighting. Shlomo is again fighting now for the Israeli army. This guy, by the time he was 25, he served in 4 different armies. But this is kind of like what happens with them. So I'm nearly done with this story. I see you're asking good questions on the side. On that side. I'm going to leave it for the Q&A, which will start in a second. So I'm just summarizing the people who passed away. Seva Pilitzer, who was killed on her way back to school. Aaron Simcha Pilitzer died in the ghetto, and his wife died in the gas chambers in Medanek. And over my head is my grandfather's father, who died in the ghetto, and Fela Kaufman, who died in the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Ravensbrück, that's the camp that she was in with my grandmother, the name that I forgot before. The picture I have here is my grandmother standing in front of her house. She went back at some point in the 80s to visit and to see whether she can get back and see her house. So it's a picture of her with one of those, how do I do it so you'll see? She's holding in her hands one of those 80s tape recorders. Do you remember those things? Really, really annoying tape recorders. Anyway, she went back. They let her see the house where she grew up. Clearly other people were living there. And because I didn't want to end with just the sadness of what happened, I kind of thought I will end with a picture of me with my grandparents, because it's the next generation. So this is me, that really small little one there. You can see I haven't changed much. I still look the same. And my grandmother, on the woman on the side is my mom. She's kind of like photobombing this. My grandparents, they ended up living kind of like a life. They came out of this, had children, had grandchildren. They did not live to a terribly old age in modern terms because they lived a tough life. My grandfather died in his early 60s. My grandmother died in her 70s. But they lived a life. She became eventually a teacher, a school principal in Tel Aviv. Then she became the CEO of the Jewish Organization for Hard of Hearing, for people who are hard of hearing. Then she became the executive director of Masua, which was the Holocaust Memorial organization that brought kids from the United States and Canada to Israel to learn about the Holocaust. And my grandfather was a lawyer, and the only good piece of advice he gave my father is whatever you do, don't go to law school. Which unfortunately my father didn't tell me. So what I've done in college is gone to law school. You see how well it went for me because I became a rabbi and not a lawyer. So this is quickly the story of my family during the war and how they made their home in Israel, where I was born. I think I will turn this back to Gabby to see if we can do some Q&A. I see you've asked some questions. I'll let Gabby run that. And I am going to maybe even, while Gabby is kind of like setting us up, I'm going to close the background part of this and share, so I can maybe share with you. So I can close the green screen and you can just see me with normal background, like a real person. Gabby.
Thank you, Rabbi Eliana. That was a great talk. It was really interesting. So we have about 10-15 minutes for a little bit of a Q&A. So if people have questions about Rabbi Eliana's talk or about the library or really about anything, I'm going to encourage you to please put them in the chat, and then I can like read them out and we'll answer them. So I know that there was one in here about how did you get all of those photos? How did they survive the war?
That is like a real, it's a great question. It's a big question. So there were some photos that my family left with other relatives, like the pictures from before the war were pictures that were left with other relatives that they were able to retrieve from these other like distant relatives or people who were, the reason that those pictures are all from their vacation homes is because some of the other people who vacationed in the same places and were friends did end up making it through the war. And so they were able to get some pictures back from these people. Most of the stuff that they have left is stuff that they buried in the ground. They buried stuff in the ground in a box. My father showed me that box actually earlier this week. He still has it, and I didn't know. He said this box was in his parents' bedroom, and he knew that he's not allowed to touch that box. But we still have the box that was in the ground. It was buried, surrounded by old fabric to keep the rain from soaking in, and they put in there some of their documents and pictures of the family and some other trinkets, and so that's the stuff we have left. Some of the other documents that they have, they just buried stuff in different places. When my grandmother went back, she tried to unearth some of it. They also buried 2 pieces of silver, things that were important to them. My grandparents, my grandma's parents' candlesticks, which are at my parents' house right now, and her sugar cube box. Those were the 2 things, which was actually an Etrog box, but it was used by my secular grandma as a sugar cube box, which is a good Polish homes. You like to drink your tea with sugar cubes. And so those 2 things remained. Most Jewish people, it was really dangerous to come back and try to dig out the stuff you hid in the ground. because everyone knew that the Jews hid stuff in the ground. And a lot of times the people who took over their homes, the first thing they've done is dug their entire yard and tried to find stuff. And also there were people who followed, and Jews who came back to their homes after the war to see if they hid money and jewels and stuff like that. So that's where the documents come from, some of them. The boat that they were on, as I said, they were fortunate enough that this famous journalist, this famous American journalist, who ended up writing this book, Underground to Palestine, he was on, so Aya Stone was basically on this underground mission when he was there with a photographer, and they were got on one of those boats and they were trying to document what it's like for the Jewish refugees who were trying to leave Europe. So there's some, this is how we have some pictures um, from that from that journey. The certificates, I understand that my grandmother went back at some point to bury stuff, like, so she had a stash, and then they would put all the certificates and the documents there to save them. So when they got back to Lodz after the war, she was able to retrieve some of those. I do not know who took the pictures from the ghetto or how they ended up having those. I have no idea.
So we also have a question. What happened to Shlomo and David?
I'll start with David because that's easy. I don't know enough for it to be long. David, he ended up he survived. He lived a long life, but he became a mine engineer. And he became a member of the Soviet party, where he got married to someone who wasn't Jewish, had kids, was part. He was a good communist person, and so there was no connection, no relationship. I never got to meet him. I believe my father met him once, that one time he got to see him. I know that Shlomo supported him financially throughout his entire life, and my grandmother and my grandfather too, that they would send them money to Russia when things were tough. And I know that he has children. I know I have relatives on that side of the family, but I don't know anything about them. Shlomo made it back to Palestine with my grandparents, and he lived with them for a while. They were set in this very luxurious asbestos shed, the way people were settled in those times. And in a bizarre way, that shed survived, and I got to visit it with my father, because that's where he was born. I got to see it some years ago. I was completely shocked that it's remained. I would have never found it because it's kind of like in backyards of something. But he lived with them for a while, but he was very restless, young man and restless. And he took a job with the Israeli, with the Jewish agency. I think it was called the Jewish Agency, where they would send emissaries all over Europe to talk to Jews about making Aliyah. So he was sent as an emissary to Canada, to Montreal. And he met a nice Jewish girl in Montreal, Shirley, and he got married. And so that's how I had a great uncle in Montreal until pretty recently. He passed away some years ago. But yes, he lived his life in Montreal. He didn't have children, but he really liked skiing, and he was on the Canadian ski rescue kind of like thing, and he was awesome. And he would come visit us in Israel once in a while. And he really loved oranges for the rest of his life. So those days that he was hidden in that orchard really left a mark.
So I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I had a question. So what inspired you to come up with this presentation, and how did you get all the information? Like, is it just stuff that your grandparents told you? Or was it based on your research as a grad student? Yeah.
Um, well, the information I have is a result of information I gathered from different family members and information that I have from my academic studies. But the way that this came about, this idea of me giving this talk, my grandfather refused to talk about what happened in the war. He never talked. And until he died when he was 64, my grandmother didn't talk to us about it either. But after my grandfather died, my grandmother started giving lectures in high schools in Israel. So she wouldn't talk to us about the war, but she talked to other people about the war. And there were recordings, there were tape recordings of some of those talks. And then when she worked for this organization, Holocaust Remembrance, she clearly have done much more. When she felt she was getting older or sicker, I was a journalist when I was young. I wanted to be an author. I was working as a journalist. So my grandmother figured that I'm the most likely person in the family to record or write a book about what happened with their family. So she made those tapes. What she said was, "I'm making those tapes, I'm recording myself on this ugly tape recorder that I just showed you. I don't know that I can handle thinking about this. So whenever I feel like I can talk about something, I will just hit record and speak, and I will stop when I can't handle it anymore. I don't intend to listen to what I recorded. I might stop in the middle of a story. I don't care. I'm going to put on this tape what I can when I can." And she recorded 12 tapes and she gave them to me when she was already very sick. And she said, "Please listen to these tapes because I have no idea what's on them. And I suspect that stories are cut in the middle. So listen and then ask me what you need more than that." But I was young and a teenager and it wasn't on my mind. So the first time I actually listened to those tapes were at her Shiva, when we were sitting Shiva for her. My father and I made a transcription of those tapes. And yes, there was a lot of stuff that was cut really, really short. I dreaded hearing the phone in the background. It always meant that she would just like hang up and go talk on the phone to someone instead. So those tapes are the source of some of the other information I have. But the way that this really came about started actually when I was already living in Boston. I gave up on doing academic study of the Holocaust because I had a mental breakdown. I had a mental breakdown while I was studying records for dissertation. I was studying records which were letters that the Germans wrote to their families during the war. And those letters, there were letters in which these German soldiers were complaining. There were German soldiers that were positioned on top of the trains that took Jews from the ghettos to the concentration camps. And they put German soldiers on top of the trains. Their role was to shoot anyone who tried to jump out of the train. So those soldiers are writing to their parents and the families, and they're complaining that it's really hot on top of the train and their food rations are getting bad. The sausage and the stuff that they have is getting bad. And all of a sudden, like I had like this moment when I thought, what about the dates? What if this is like the same train that my great grandmother was taken to the camps on? And I realized that I just can't handle it, and that maybe it's not on me, and other people need to do this academic research. So at that point, I changed my major and went to study medieval history instead. But I had all of this knowledge, and there was nothing to do with it anymore. And it was not sitting well with me that I'm like not doing anything with it, especially since at that point it became kind of clear that I'm not going to write a book. And then I get this phone call from this teacher, this elementary school teacher in Winter Hill, she teaches English as second language to these kids who pretty much came to Somerville from all over the world. Some of them escaped pretty bad conditions themselves. She says that she's studying with them the diary of Anne Frank. And in the middle, one kid raises her hand and says to her, "Can you explain that word?" And she said, "What word?" And she says, "Jew. I don't know that word." And so the teacher called, because I was the local rabbi, and she says, "Can you come and talk to the kids? Can you tell them something?" And I talked to the kids, and these kids were refugees themselves, and they asked me questions that were mind-boggling to me. Like they wanted to know how deep into the ground the fences around the ghetto were. Like, was it dug deep enough underground that you weren't able to like dig underneath to get away? Like the questions were so practical. Like I felt like they completely put themselves in that position. So like what happened is that um, it gave me a different look at the memory of the Holocaust. Because I want to say I was teaching Holocaust in Jewish schools my entire adult life. And at that point, I was teaching at the local synagogue also. But I never talked to non Jewish people. I never talked to kids like that before. And I realized that they don't have a sense. School teaches them about particular people, but they have no sense of the trajectory of the war and what happened. And so I had this lecture to give to those kids. And I sat and I wrote the story of my grandparents. At that point, I only had like 3 pictures. And I mostly was trying to build, if I had to tell kids in 1 hour what happened in the Holocaust overall and make it personal. So I kind of like tried to weave the story of my family into the bigger arc of the Holocaust. That was the first time I gave that lecture. They wrote me those letters saying that it's a love story and that it's a beautiful love story and I have to keep telling it to people. And so it has evolved from there. I've been giving it in public schools in Winchester, other towns around here. And I've been giving it in settings where I'm talking to adults and grown-ups. And over time, I found more resources and kind of like fine-tuned it. But pretty much that's how it came about. It's instead of a book.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you. I think that's like a librarian's dream over there. Like, um, just so the rest of you know, like I also have Holocaust survivor grandparents, and when I started working here, I said I started looking for people who could give talks on Holocaust survivors, and then I said, wait a minute, I could do this. I have all of this information also from my grandparents, so um, doing all of that research and putting something together is like a librarian's dream, I think. So I'm looking forward to doing that. So come back next year, everyone, and come see me talk. Um, Unfortunately, we have to cut it off now because I have a hard stop time of 1:30 on my Zoom here. But thank you everyone for coming.